Harry spent a lot of time over the next few days dodging out of sight whenever he saw Gilderoy Lockhart coming down a corridor. Harder to avoid was Colin Creevey, who seemed to have memorized Harry's schedule. Nothing seemed to give Colin a bigger thrill than to say, "All right, Harry?" 6 or 7 times a day and hear, "Hello, Colin," back, however exasperated Harry sounded when he said it.
The Belated Binge Podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Belated Binge Podcast. I'm Zach, your host, revisiting some of the most iconic series in recent memory that I was incredibly late on, like our current binge of Harry Potter, where despite being the same age as movie Harry, I didn't read this series through until my mid-20s. That's the belated part. Now we're going back a chapter or two at a time, picking it apart, deep diving what's on the page, speculating about what isn't, particularly Dumbledore's role and his master plan. What did he know? When did he know it? And the motivations guiding the story. And of course, infusing as much sarcasm as humanly possible. That's the binge part. Together they make the belated binge, and today we continue our reread of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets with Chapter 7, Mudbloods Murmurs. Before we can get into it, this podcast will have spoilers. This series wrapped up in 2007. If you haven't read them by now, you're even later than I was. This podcast will also have some adult language. You can buy them in the kids section of the bookstore, but I didn't read them until I was, say it with me, a grown-ass man. We have no patrons, so no patron shoutouts. If you want to change that, check it out, patreon.com/belatedbinge. However, we do have special announcement. In the next episode of this very podcast, I will have another special guest with me. Christina from the Restricted Section podcast will be gracing us with her presence. If that name sounds familiar at all to you, I went on the Restricted Section several weeks ago now for the Ultimate Villain Monologue chapter in Goblet of Fire. I'm fairly certain it's still the longest episode ever recorded on the Restricted Section feed, and I will wear that crown with honor and confirm when she's here just to make sure that nobody's broken it yet. But that was the Veritaserum chapter. We'll see how long we can go over here. We're going to talk about the Death Day Party. So that's going to be pretty exciting for our next episode. For now, in case you're obliviated or you got your Hogwarts letter late, last chapter, Ron got a howler. We learned about mandrakes, and we met a couple key new Muggleborn characters, Justin Finch-Fletchley and Colin Creevey. And then we had our first Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson with the new professor, who proved to be an egotistical douchebag and is clearly incompetent. Before we can move on into this episode's chapter, we need to close the book on the last one and recap our
Expecto Plot Changeo.
This is the part of the show where we theorize on what we would expect to change in our story if we made one small adjustment to the plot of the chapter we are covering. In the last chapter, I asked, what if Justin Finch-Fletchley wasn't introduced to Harry? He was in another group for herbology class. Would it change anything to come in this book? We got quite a few likes and even some retweets and some shares and whatnot on social media, but nobody actually answered the question. So, from my perspective, this one's actually kind of tricky. So, the biggest impact that Justin Finch-Fletchley has on this story is the upcoming snake scene during the Dueling Club chapter. We haven't gotten there yet, but we will soon, so I don't want to go into depth of those details, because then you wouldn't have a reason to listen to that episode, other than the special guest. Who will it be? Stay tuned. Woohoo. Anyways, but it's when Draco brings a snake to a wand fight and Lockhart pisses it off with his incompetence, along with the rest of us. As we know, Harry is a Parselmouth and stops the snake from murdering Justin. However, since no one else speaks Parseltongue, everyone freaks out, thinks Harry is telling the snake to attack him, despite the order of events as they take place. I bring it up still, even though I don't want it to become the focus of this discussion too much, But I bring it up because it's still going to happen. But if Justin doesn't introduce himself to Harry and tell Harry that he's Muggleborn by telling him what school he was... Never mind. Details are not important. If Harry doesn't know that Justin Finch Fletchley is Muggleborn from that conversation that they had during that introduction, perhaps there's a layer of motivation that gets missing from the rumors that go around the school following that dueling club scene. Because if Harry doesn't know Justin and has no idea that he's Muggleborn, then maybe more people are going to be hesitant to peg Harry for the heir of Slytherin going around trying to kill Muggleborns right away. But honestly, it probably doesn't matter because it's not going to change what people see in Dueling Club. It won't change the stigma of Parseltongue. They'll still think he's evil, probably. They'll put 2 and 2 together about Salazar Slytherin being a parcel mouth. They'll think Harry's related to him. They'll see the blood on the wall about the heir, and they'll think it's Harry. So I guess it doesn't make any difference whether Justin introduces himself ahead of time. Kids are just going to connect the dots anyways. But I am going to predict a foreshadow about our foreshadow segment to come. Is that meta? Or I guess it's maybe our Riddikulus segment, actually. So is it now not meta? Is it still meta because I'm foreseeing something about the podcast on the podcast? I don't actually understand how meta works. Anyways, I'm going to find it ridiculous that everyone's so quick to believe he's a Muggleborn hater when his best friend is Muggleborn. She's very much alive. And then when she's petrified, people don't think that it's Harry. Hell, that would be when I would actually believe it. When nobody's safe. Whatever. We're completely off the rails at this point. We're talking way too much about that chapter, but the two are together with the question, I guess. Long story short, not a lot changes. Because kids are still going to suck, I guess. And that wraps up our chat from the last chapter by talking about a chapter in the future. So I guess I botched that whole thing. Sorry, y'all. Let's just get to this week's question here real fast. I'll pull up my phone, flip it around to video style, and we will do our little selfie for this episode's question. This week's Expecto Plot Change-O question comes from Chapter 7 of Chamber of Secrets, Mudbloods Murmurs, and it is, what if Ron's wand wasn't broken by the Whomping Willow? How could that change the events in the immediate? Perhaps the future? Let me know your thoughts to be included in the next episode of the podcast. This video I just took will be posted on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. We'll put it up on Twitter, at least the question. I don't always put the video on Twitter because it seems like nobody sees it when I do that. But if I pose the question, it gets some traction. Anyways, you can respond with your thoughts on any of those platforms, or you can leave them as a voicemail on my website, belatedbinge.com. If you don't like the sound of your own voice, there is also a form that you can use as well. Now, let's dive into the events of this week's chapter with
Priority in chapter.
We've reached the point where our wands connect. Not the tips, just the streams. So we can recap what went down in the chapter we just read. This week in Chapter 7, Mudbloods Murmurs, it starts off lighthearted enough, I guess, albeit with shades of obsession as Harry's trying to duck and dodge and weave and hide from, well, a professor in Lockhart and a classmate in Colin Creevey. And he's trying to avoid them both at all costs, which I guess is sort of lighthearted. It's played for laughs, but it's kind of creepy when you think about it. This is a 12-year-old boy who can't seem to go to the urinal alone. Actually, Harry never goes to the urinal once in this series. It makes me worry about his well-being and his bladder. It's Saturday morning, and Oliver's Wood for Quidditch gets Harry up at the ass crack of dawn. And before Harry heads to practice, he leaves Ron a note about where he went. And this is, I'm just going to say it, it's fucking adorable. I'm now imagining that this is a normal thing for the two of them. They're just so attached at the hip that if one goes somewhere solo, they feel as though they have to leave a note. There's a quick exchange with Colin that's actually funny. He got his picture of Harry and Lockhart developed. Officially, I guess? But, like, wasn't it a Polaroid that they already signed? What was that whole thing that happened? It seems like maybe the first was a Muggle picture, and now somehow Colin has a wizard version, because it's actually got Lockhart trying to pull Harry into the photo, and Harry's fighting him off until Lockhart just, like, sits and pouts. It's funny, but I feel like I completely missed something in the logistics of how it actually became a thing. Regardless, I'm going to say it again. It's funny. So moving on. Harry refuses to sign this one, though, and kind of looks around to make sure nobody was listening. And Colin follows him to Quidditch practice. Because that's what stalkers do. And we love Colin. We end up loving Colin. Right now, I don't think we love Colin. Let's just be honest. Right now, we don't love Colin. He's kind of just annoying for Harry. And he's annoying because he does things like this, like follow him to Quidditch practice. And along the way, Harry's graciously, if not annoyed the whole time, explaining the game of Quidditch to his biggest fan. After a bunch of coaching and whatnot in the locker room, they're about to start practice when the drama starts. Slytherin shows up. They brought a note from Snape that they can apparently kick anybody off the field they want, I guess, because that's how competitive fair play works in schools, if you were unsure. And speaking of fair competition in schools, we quickly learn that Draco has become the new seeker for Slytherin, and that his daddy bought the whole team the latest and greatest Nimbus 2001 brooms. So that's a thing. And for some reason, Ron and Hermione show up in a crowd of Quidditch players because, well, the plot needs them to be there. That's really the only way I can explain this. Because as somebody who grew up playing sports his entire life, I couldn't tell you a single time when a student at the school that we played for would even be at practice, let alone able to walk into it. But, again, plot. For some reason, this is how we got here. I don't know. But this is when Malfoy is bragging about the brooms that his daddy bought the team, and he's shitting on the cheaper models that other students have, particularly the Weasleys. Hermione gets one off about how nobody on Gryffindor bought their way onto the team, and Malfoy calls her a mudblood. Melee ensues, basically. Between these two teams, Ron tries to fire a curse at Malfoy, and of course his wand is broken, so now he's the one throwing up slugs, which is fun. Harry and Hermione take Ron and Hagrid, nearly trampling a nosy Colin Creevey on the way, who was trying to capture the moment on Kodak. For Gen Z, that's a brand of camera that people used to use to take pictures of things before we all had phones with 87 lenses in our pockets. Imagine having to go to Walmart. That's a physical store where you actually walk in and buy things off of shelves with money. And you had to wait for like an hour for a roll of film to actually be developed. That's where they print your pictures out from those cameras onto special paper in a dark room. And dark rooms, well, they're dark rooms where pictures are developed. The whole thing's crazy. I know. It's cray-cray or something. That's not Gen Z, right? Who had cray-cray? I have no idea. Anyways, of course, because we have to be pounded over the head with how incompetent Lockhart is and how much of a douche he is, The trio has to duck his uselessness when they go to Hagrid's hut, whose response to Ron's predicament is, "Better out than in." He then recounted for Harry why Lockhart was there in the first place. Of course, we all know the answer to this before it was written on the page. It was to tell him how to do his job. But Hagrid's not buying his bullshit either. And this is where we get confirmation that Lockhart was the only person who would take the DADA job. And the reason why is going to come up later in this podcast. In turn, the trio tell Hagrid what went down on the Quidditch pitch, and this is where our boy Ron actually shines. Unlike the movie, where Ron is useless. In the books, Ron actually explains what a mudblood means and why Draco and his family are the Wizarding World equivalent of racist pieces of shit. Hagrid gives Harry shit about signed pictures and takes him to see his pumpkins. That's not a mistake. I didn't have a typo there. That's really in the book. And he brings up Ginny and alludes to her crush on Harry. And at this point, a lot has gone down in this chapter. But we've hit the high notes. But here's a couple of things, just organic thoughts in the moment for you on this. For starters, I don't know how many of you listening to this podcast are movie people versus book people. But this is one of the pretty popular reasons that some fans of this series, particularly book fans, don't like the movies or what they did in the movies, or even don't like Hermione in the movies. And it's because of stuff like this. It's because in the books, Ron is the one that has background in the Wizarding World. He's lived in it all his life. He has 100 brothers and sisters that have been to school before him. He's gotten, sometimes completely outlandish rumor versions of what Hogwarts is like, or, school, and just basically how stuff works in the Wizarding World. Harry and Hermione grew up in the Muggle world. They've got no fucking idea how anything works in the Wizarding World. Nothing. Unless Hermione has read it in a book and then told Harry about it, they are clueless. Ron is our lens into the Wizarding World the majority of the time in the books. That's his contribution to the trio in a lot of ways, is being able to essentially magic-splain things to these other two when, again, the answer hasn't been written in a textbook that Hermione has memorized at this point. I mean, she's 12. She hasn't gotten through them all yet. But that's why in this chapter, Ron explaining very complex and difficult content to these two when it comes to Mudbloods and the amount of what pure blood wizardry even is, and how it's a load of shit, because how even quote-unquote pure blood wizards aren't actually pure blood, because if all of the wizards were they would have died out, because there aren't enough wizards to keep the population of wizards actually alive. And it's actually really insightful when we look past the vomiting of slugs and the fact that it's coming from a 12-year-old boy during this passage. But the movies don't give us that. The movies give us Hermione actually getting upset, which, again, she didn't do in the book because she didn't know she was supposed to be pissed. And she explains it to us. Like she has some kind of in-depth knowledge about what kind of, I don't want to use the word oppression, but what kind of treatment Muggle-born wizards and witches have gotten over the centuries or over the years, or the types of struggles she's had to deal with. Oh yeah, never, because she grew up with Muggles and she's 12. She doesn't understand the weight of a slur like mudblood. She didn't even know what it meant, so she didn't actually react. It was the kids who grew up in wizarding culture who knew to be upset, and they were the ones fighting on the Quidditch pitch. Hence Ron vomiting slugs right now, because that's what Draco should be doing. But again, that's not what we get in the movies, because everything that Ron does well, every smart moment, every moment of intelligence that Ron has, until the absolute very end of Deathly Hallows, go to Hermione in the movies. And again, that's part of the reason why, particularly book fans, don't love the movies sometimes, and don't love Hermione in the movies. And that's just a theory from one book fan. Anyways, so where was I in this chapter? Yes, Hagrid's giving Harry shit about autographing pictures, pretending that he wants one, which is, I mean, let's be honest, it's hilarious. This is what friends do. I mean, Hagrid's not a teacher yet, and so he really is just playing the role of friend here. Maybe a little bit mentor, but mostly friend. And this is what friends do. They give each other shit. And I like it. And then he takes him to see his pumpkins. And that's not a euphemism, it's literal pumpkins. Pumpkins out in his pumpkin patch, I guess. Whatever. And then he does what? He gives him shit about Ginny. Ginny coming to see him and talking about the engorgement charm that he put on the pumpkins and how well he did and all of that. And Hagrid saying that Ginny was likely there because she thought maybe she would run into a particular chosen one. So now it's lunchtime, and Prof. McGee finds them to serve them their detentions. And by them, I mean Harry and Ron, because remember that whole flying car thing that happened? Now we're finally getting our punishment. It's like 2 chapters later, and we're finally getting our detention from that. Ron has to polish trophies with Filch, and Harry has to help Lockhart answer his fan mail, which is basically akin to torture for Harry. Remember early in this chapter when I said that Harry is ducking and avoiding Lockhart and Colin Creevey like the plague because they're both like obsessed with him? Now he's being forced to sit next to this obsessed teacher who won't leave him alone as punishment. We thought that going into the Forbidden Forest in Book 1 was bad and dangerous and cruel, even. This might be worse. I'm just saying. So Harry's addressing envelopes, a skill that you learn growing up in the Muggle world. And after who knows how long... And you know what? Let me stop there. Why is he addressing envelopes? They're going to be sent by owl post, right? Don't they just need a name on the envelope? Is that what he's actually doing? He's just writing people's names on envelopes, not actually addressing them? Because why would they need their address on the envelope for the owl? The owl's just going to go find them because, like, magic. Anyways, after who knows how long, Harry's, like, begging for this shit to be over. And by who knows how long, I mean, in Harry's mind, he literally has no idea how long he's been there. Which is insane. And then he thinks maybe he's insane. Because he hears a voice out of nowhere saying insane shit. Let me rip you. Let me tear you. Let me kill you. It's straight up kids' book stuff. Lockhart doesn't hear anything. But he does let Harry leave. Because Harry hasn't been able to comprehend how much time has passed because it's been like 4 hours. I'm pretty sure my detentions at his age were like an hour long tops. Points and punishment in this school make no sense. Where have I heard that before? So Harry and Ron are back at Gryffindor dorm room, and they're comparing notes on their experience in detention. And they go to bed pondering where the hell those voices came from. And that's it. That wraps up the chapter. A very lighthearted chapter. You know, we just have possible mental health issues. We have possible stalking and obsession. We have blatant racism. Oh, there's also a hint of budding romance, or the drama of the pursuit, I guess. It's probably not the best way to say that, but like, there's heavy shit in this chapter that's written for children. But, alas, it's what we got. Taking us into